So we check the lower frame. I like to check the oil cooler. So all you're going to do is push to open. Open that, make sure there's no grass, no bird's nest in the making. Notice you can look outside right there. So anyhow, no obstructions. It'll cool really nice. Let go. Once again, I like my system may be different, but as long as I use the checklist to verify what I've done, you're good to go. The torque stripes are not broken, so you know everything's still nice and tight. There's no leaks. Most likely you're not going to find a leak up here. It's going to be down at a lower point where the oil has to come around. See, water drops. It's not oil. Let's see. Follow those oil lines all the way back. They go on up to the oil filter. If you have a blown oil cooler, you're not going to see a leak. I've never seen a leak on the top. Check the bottom of the oil cooler and see if there's any leaks, any oil drops. If there is, you may have an oil cooler, not an oil line, an oil cooler with a crack or a hole in it. So we're going to check the lower teletemp, lower bearing teletemp. I think there's 3 filled in on this one. I need to draw a new line. You can tell since the last person's drawn the line on this teletemp, it's gotten a little hotter. This thing only has 100 hours of its out of its overhaul, so anyhow, something to keep your eye on. Draw a new line and see if that thing continues to get hotter. You're down here, make sure there's nothing in the belts. This is your starter. Okay? So what I like to do here, spin it out, make sure it goes back in. If you release it and doesn't go back in, you're not going to have a good time starting this thing. Note all your torque stripes are good. It's not going anywhere. Check your wiring. Make sure that's properly secured. And follow that wiring harness all the way down. Make sure it's not rubbing up against anything, because things get pretty hot back here. Check for grease behind the back of that sheath. If the lower bearing is leaking or slinging grease, it may be on the back, or check it on the front. Stick your finger in there. See, I got some black. That was just dust residue though, and a little water mixture. So that's okay. It's okay to have black dust because that's from the belts. That's very common. Alright, check your exhaust while you're right here. Make sure the fan or the heater shroud, this is your heat shroud where it clamps on. Make sure that's all nicely secured. Make sure you should see a good seal between your muffler and the shroud. This is a coupling on the exhaust, okay? 2 pieces of pipe that come together and then clamp together. So most likely you may have a leak here. Once again, there's actually a small leak on this one, just a little carbon buildup. Looks like a little lead. Alright, here are your valve covers. Now notice safety wire at the top. Make sure it's in the tightening position. Check for any leaks or on each valve cover. Notice another safety wire. There's only one that's required from Robinson. Another safety wire going up and around. Another safety wire. Most likely if there's going to be leaking, it's going to be dripping off the bottom of that valve cover. This line with the blue fitting on it, that's your oil line. Okay, there's one for each cylinder. Should have a nice torque stripe. So that one's good. That's cylinder number 4. Here's cylinder number 2. Notice once again same oil line. This is your bottom. This is one of the 2 spark plugs per cylinder. This is your lower spark plug. There's one that's on the top, which we can't see. Right. Check oil lines, leaking, spark plugs, wiring harness. Here is your carb heat scoop. This is your fresh air. This is where your fresh air comes in if your carb heat is not on. If your carb heat's on, then it draws air from this line, which gets its air from the heat shroud covering up this exhaust. Clamp it. Make sure the clamps are tight. It's not going anywhere. Good. Wiring harness. Here's your voltage regulator. This is probably what's referring to when it refers to electrical something. Grounds. Make sure that's nice and tight. This is your heater hose that goes into your aircraft. So make sure your lines are nice and secured. Fresh air intake comes from this guy. Make sure there's a clamp on it. Make sure it's nice and tight. See this long vertical tube? That's your breather for your engine. All the time, what you'll find is that when you go to pull the aircraft out in the morning, there'll be a puddle of oil. Actually, you can see a drop of oil right there. Anyhow, a lot of time if you have more oil than the engine wants or likes, it'll blow a lot of oil out. On R22 here, not this one, a different one, anything over 5 1/4, it'll blow out. You can go through a lot of oil really fast and nothing's happening. The engine's not burning it, it's just blowing it out. It doesn't like it. But it will stabilize. This is your left magneto, but it's on the right side. This is a Lycoming 0360, but it's facing backwards. So this is the right side of the aircraft, but it's the left magneto, it's the left side of the engine. Alright, so we've checked the main rotor, gearbox, cowling doors, we've checked all that. Checked towards the back, we've checked the engine right side. We need to check the frame or the skids. Just back right. Notice it's tight. You got your grounding wire. Follow it down. Check for cracks in the strut. This is a nice little feature. Make sure that's not bent up too bad. See this cross tube? Aircraft that have had really hard landings or just really tired from a lot of landings, that'll be smiling at you. If it's smiling too much, or if you have a question if it's smiling too much, check with your mechanic, because there are limitations on that. Alright, let's check the fan area. You've already checked all the screws. Come back here, this is your fan scroll. Nice and clean. It's a little wet from me washing it. Each one of these you should check, visually check, and we also have a sound check you can do too. Check for cracks in the weld, chips, nicks, you name it. A lot of stuff's getting sucked through here. It's kind of echoey. And there's a torque stripe on this one. Basically every one of these, except for that one, all the way around. Torque stripes are not required on each one of these, but it's a nice thing to have. Torque stripe once again. This is your fan scroll nut. This is that cotter pin that goes through. Notice the cotter pin should line up with your marks. If, say, your marks are right there, but your cotter pin's going straight up and down, most likely what's happened is someone has started this thing up full throttle on startup. This fan is pressed onto the shaft. There's no key that prevents it from turning. It's just pressed on. So if there's an instant amount of torque, this whole fan will shift, so something to look out for. So back side, check your antennas. Coming back the tail boom. Each one of these rivets, there's a bulkhead, so you want to make sure all these rivets are nice and tight. Should be no black residue around it. If there is, you know that rivet's coming out. Other antenna, make sure it's nice and tight. And you just basically look down the tail boom as well and see if there's any wrinkles. Visually check it. These are inspection ports, inspection holes to make sure your drive shaft is still within limits as far as straightness. Coming back, here's your anti-collision or strobe light. Make sure it's properly secured. No cracks, no corrosion. Danger. This little candy cane here prevents people from walking into the tail rotor, so make sure that's there. Alright, so here's the empennage. You got your vertical stabilizer, you got your horizontal stabilizer. The two attachment bolts are right there, so there's only two bolts that are holding this whole empennage on. Make sure those are tight. Coming down here you have your stinger. This thing's been drugged. You'll be able to tell it on the bottom so you can run your hand. This one hasn't been drugged, so I obviously hasn't done too many autos with students. If you do contact the tail, look for wrinkles right here at the mounting point for that stinger. It's a weak point. Coming on around, check out your position light in the back, make sure there's no cracks. It's also properly secured.